Hello, everybody out there on the interwebs, on the YouTubes, on your handies, your phones, your computers, your tablets. Mike McDonald here, along with Chris Stiles. FSUFO, we're called Forbidden Science UFO, or as Chris calls it, Forbidden Science, because he's a little bit of a Jacques Vallée fan who wrote that great book, Forbidden Science. We have a really fabulous show lined up today. We've got Ralph Lowewinger. He's a pilot who flew Pan Am Flight 160 back in the days of the 60s. This is related to Shag Harbor, as we'll find out, potentially. The Shag Harbor UFO incident. They had an encounter. 30,000 hours in the air, this pilot. So when a pilot with 30,000 air time of 30,000 hours tells you that something unusual happened, you got to take that to heart, right, Chris?
Yeah, I do. I did the first time I heard the story for sure. You know, Michael, just a little bit to set up before we bring our guest on. You know, I've often referred to the Shag Harbor incident as a gift that keeps on giving. And this is one of those examples because, as you know, in the early days, when you did your initial feature documentary, you were the first on the Shag Harbor incident. We did not know about Pan Am 160. There was another
That's
flight
true.
that many connected at the time, and it was Air Canada 305, also a cargo flight, right? One of the old
That's right.
Viscounts back in the day.
Yeah.
And the thing about that flight is eventually in the year 2008, I turned that case into an IFO. We identified it, and we did so to the satisfaction of the pilots, which was Bob Ralph and Guy Charbonneau. And, I won't put you through all that. And that was ancient history. And even putting that one to bed was very interesting. Quite a story in itself. And it's in the last chapter of the book. But, that promise of Shag forever giving. 6 weeks later, we discovered Pan Am 160, and it had to do with a ghost story in Pennsylvania and the help of a name we all know in this show, the late Stanton Friedman. And we'll get
Stanton.
that to come out, and I'll jump in and sprinkle that amongst Ralph. But rather than, tease and hold that over us any further, why don't we bring on our guest and welcome a career pilot who has a story to tell, and he has a mission today. He's going to put us in that cockpit back on October the 3rd. That's right, the 3rd, the night before, 1967.
Well, let's get that story. Ralph, welcome to FSUFO. You're looking great.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Ralph's coming us to today from Daytona Beach. And boy, that's enough here in Nova Scotia looking at the weather to make one grieve and consider taking that trip soon, since we're allowed to travel and leave our backyard these days, it would seem. Anyway, yeah, Ralph was a career pilot there with Pan Am for a long time. He did fly with other airlines. I think what JAL later on was it or
No, after Pan Am's bankruptcy, I went to China Airlines and Atlas Air, and another outfit where I taught ground school and aircraft systems in Detroit.
Nice.
And Pan Am was my last full-time permanent job.
So before we jump to that night that we're all here for today, Ralph, why don't you just explain to our audience here? You were with Pan Am for a long time. This was a weekly routine. This flight, I think, you used to go from JFK to Heathrow and on after that. But maybe you should set up the routine of what your job was back in '67.
Well, Flight 160 was maybe if it wasn't daily, it was 3 times a week, something like that. And it actually began in New York as a continuation of the westbound flight and went down to Dulles. That's where we got on in New York and went down to Dulles in Washington. And then that began the eastbound trip of Flight 160. And then we loaded up fresh cargo in Washington and proceeded back to New York, where they really loaded the airplane up. And We departed, I would guess, about 10 p.m. on a beautiful night, and we arrived up in the Yarmouth, Nova Scotia area about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, local time. And it was my leg because the captain, Kurt Olson, he had taken the first leg or two, and it was my turn. So I was responsible for flying the airplane, setting up all the navigation equipment for our journey across the Atlantic. And we were kind of huddled together in the cockpit. Nothing was going on. There were 2 extra crew members as required by the contract. They were in the back resting. We had some first class seats in the very, very front of the cargo area and for extra crew members. And so the 3 of us were more or less huddled together, just having a conversation. And I was the first one to see a formation of lights, which looked initially like a large airplane would be 707, DC-8, or B-52 at the time. It looked like an airplane coming directly at us with all of its lights on. There was a string of lights, 5 or 6 lights, as I recall, and they were at 11 o'clock to our position, a little high, in what appeared to be a left bank. Now, that would have taken their path across our bow. And I said to my compatriots, I said, "Ooh, let's watch this guy." And they looked up and they saw it. And our hands went to the control yoke, and as in preparation for disconnecting the autopilot, because you look at something like that and your first instinct is, oops, we have to manually steer this airplane who knows where, and so it must come off autopilot. And so I said, let's watch this guy. They did. They turned around. They saw the same thing I did. We stood and we stood our ground and let the autopilot continue flying us straight ahead. And it was a very, very clear night. Every light in Nova Scotia was visible over towards New Brunswick and Maine. You could see the coast. It was a gorgeous night. So there was no question that what we were looking at was what we thought we were looking at, a formation of lights. So after a minute or two, with no apparent movement, we called Boston Center. It was, I believe I got on the radio and I said, "Hey, Boston, you still have us on radar?" And he said, "Yep." And he watches for a sweep or two of his radar in those days. So there's always a little delay in his answering when he's looking. And so I said, who is this traffic up here at 11 o'clock? And there was a pause while he looked, and he came back. He said, "Clipper, I don't have any traffic near you." And I said, "Well, we are looking at a formation at 11 o'clock. And he watched and his scope, paused, and then said, "Well, I don't have anything. I got a refueling formation north of you about 40 miles. And I said, that's not what we're looking at. Coincidentally, I had been based at Harmon Air Force Base in Stephenville, Newfoundland for a few years. And I know, and I was in the refueling game, and I know exactly what refueling formations look like. And so I said, that's not what we're looking at. And there was a pause, and he said, "Clipper, do you want to file a UFO report?" And being a new co-pilot, it wasn't my decision. I looked over at Kurt, and he looked at me, and he shook his head. He said, "Nah, no more paperwork for tonight." So I said, "Negative, Boston." And he said, in that event, he said, "Contact the Moncton Center for your oceanic clearance. Have a nice flight. We'll see you on the way back." Meanwhile,
Mhm.
the engineer had gone back and gotten the 2 deadheading crew members and brought them up, and everybody who looked, so that would have been a total of 5 of us. Every one of us did the same thing. We looked through different panes of glass. There are about 5 panes of glass in the cockpit, and to avoid any reflections, we looked through different panes of glass. Mike Littlepage, the flight engineer, had turned all of his panel lights down real low so we could all see out. And we all saw the same thing. There was no question whether you looked through a top window or a side window or front window. And at any rate, Moncton came on the radio and started giving us our oceanic clearance, and I had to copy it down, and we had to set it up in the I can't remember. I think it was Doppler system at the time, but so I got busy with the internal business of the cockpit. The other 2 guys watched, and after maybe a total of 5 minutes, this formation, which I remember kind of staying in position. However, Mike Littlepage, the engineer, and we see each other a couple times a year. He says that he definitely remembers us closing on it. But this is all 55. This is 55 years ago or so. And excuse me if my memory isn't spot on. But at any rate, after a total of 5 minutes, this formation began slowly to accelerate, and accelerated at up to a phenomenal rate of speed towards the eastern horizon, and disappeared. And we all saw that, and we all said, "Wow, that's the fastest thing any of us had ever seen in our lives." Now, Mike spent the rest of the flight really looking out the window. He was frightened. He'll tell you today that he was frightened, but he was in a position to sit in the chair, the observer's chair, right behind the captain, and he could put his eyes and his face right close to the glass. He probably had the best view of events as they unfolded of any of us, because we were busy with other things. Well, at any rate, we went to London and got off the airplane. Another crew took it over to Europe, and I think that was a daily flight, because the next day we got the same flight, and we went through about 6 stations in Europe, delivering and picking up freight, and then a day or so later, I flew home. We flew a flight 161 back to New York, and I went home. And so about 4 or 5 days after the incident, I was driving down to Pennsylvania with my wife asleep in the right seat, and the 3 kiddies laying down in the back of the station wagon. And as often happens on a cool and crisp October night, you get radio stations from a long distance away. They call that the skip phenomenon, and radio signals will skip from a long way off. And so there I was, not paying any listening to the radio, and it happened to be a Canadian radio station, because at the break time, the announcer said, "We're switching over to the news," and he said the RCMP today has discontinued searching for lights reportedly falling into the water near Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. And so I remember reaching over and slapping my wife, who was probably asleep, and I said, "Hey, that's the incident that I was telling you about." And nothing more for 4 years. And 4 years later, I'm in bed in my hotel room in Tokyo on a layover, and I'm reading Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of Fire, or Chariots of the Gods.
Chariots of the Gods.
Chariots of the Gods. So
yeah,
it's talking about underwater light phenomenon, unidentified light formations underwater. And he says, the author, he said the most interesting and best documented occasion of this type occurred in Shag Harbor on the night of October 4th. So I remember sitting bolt upright and say, whoa, that's us. That's what we saw. So I wrote within a week or so, I wrote the publisher. I was getting ready to move to Florida from New Jersey, where I was living, but I squeezed in a letter to the author in care of the publisher. I didn't know how else, and my letter simply stated, "Hey, I just want you to know that somebody else saw that business from altitude in a cargo jet." So I never heard back from him, and some 20, it had to be 25 years later, there was a group of investigators at my farm in Pennsylvania, and they had contacted me and said, we're doing a story for Halloween at some production company in New York. And they said, we're doing a story on spooky place names for Halloween. And we noticed, and I don't know how they found this out, but they said, we noticed that you live on Bloody Spring Road. And that sounds blood curdling. And we wondered if we could come out and visit. I said, absolutely. Well, at any rate, we had a great evening, and I took them to the spring where the family was murdered back in the 1700s and French and Indian War stuff. And there was one of the gentlemen that was with this party said to me as we were walking back to the house for coffee after we had been out prowling around, and they had taken photographs and used their recording equipment. And so this gentleman said to me, you told me that you were a retired airline pilot. I said, yeah. He said, well, did you ever see anything unusual in the nights, in the sky? And I said, only once. And I said, it was up over near Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, about 25 years ago. He stopped, put his hand on my arm. He said, would that be Shag Harbor? And I said, yes. Do you know about Shag Harbor? He said, absolutely. He said, can I give your phone number to the two investigators, Chris and Don, and could they call you? And I said, absolutely. So both Chris and Don called me within a day, and each one spent about an hour. We had delightful conversations, and I basically told the story just as I have told you. And they invited me to join them in a reunion, and I think the following fall, and I did that, and I've been back one additional time, and I hope to join you guys in the fall this year if we've finished with masks and quotas. And so that's my story. I'm sticking with it, and I'd love to hear anything new that has developed, because I know that this is an unfolding story. As Chris mentioned, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
I have a couple of questions. So what altitude were you at the time? Do you remember?
The altitude would probably be about 33,000. Typically, as you burn off fuel, you climb as high as you can, and that is the most economic cruising altitude for fuel burn. So probably about 33. Could be 31 or 35.
Doing about 330 knots or so?
Well, we do it, what shows up is, in what the flight plan is based on, is Mach. There's a Mach meter, and the Mach is 0.82, and that would stay pretty much the same whether you changed altitudes or not. But as you change altitudes, the indicated airspeed changes. But it would probably be in the area of 260 or 270 indicated.
Okay, all right, indicated, but higher true airspeed. Yeah. So this thing was basically, it sounds to me from the way you recounted this incident that it was holding station and heading eastward or east northeast with you guys, and then accelerated to the east. So it never actually did really close, even though one of the observers thought it might have been closing. Is
They,
that correct, Ralph?
yeah, Michael
That is
Littlepage
correct.
believed, yeah, Michael
Yeah, Mike
Littlepage
Little,
believed you were gaining. Yes.
he
In fact,
remembers it a little differently than I do. But this is like, as I
yeah,
say, 55 years ago. But we are moving through the night sky at about 8 nautical miles a minute.
Mm-hmm.
That's
hmm
what the speed is,
Mm-hmm.
and across the ground, or no wind speed. So I would think that we would be closing on this target, and I expected
yeah,
it to close a lot more. I don't remember that we closed that much, but Mike definitely
yeah.
remembers it differently.
I
So
remember my first
go
interview
ahead.
with Michael Littlepage. I always remember when I first called, we had a bad cell connection. He was in the mountains of Colorado when I first connected with him,
Oh yeah,
and
right,
we had
right,
yeah, we had to have a second call back. And you know what I remember most about that phone call was that when he was telling me the story the way he remembered, and it was very closely followed your rendition, Ralph, but it had a few additional details. For example, like you say, he remembers gaining on it. And the most dramatic thing for me was that you said he was able to get up and move around and get up, to the windscreen, had dimmed the lights in the cabin, right? All the gauges and that.
right.
And he went up at one point, maybe this will jog your memory, and cupped his hands and looked right through the windscreen to get an even, to reduce that light pollution in his eye even more and get a glance. Because he said, he felt they were gaining on it. And, he was nervous. He readily admits it. He was the junior crew member at the time. And when he looked through the windscreen, he felt that at that point that there was only perhaps half a mile between you and you was getting closer to being aligned with your nose, and he was quite nervous. And that was also the point where he made an interpretation that I find very interesting. Is he thought the set of lights at that point he could discern enough resolution that they were not separate lights and they were not external lights on one connected object, but he thought they were internal lighting and he was actually looking into the craft. That was
I
his
remember that.
interpretation. Yes, that is just fascinating. And the other thing I remember, of course, is you put it, there was, I believe you actually used the word fear, but I can remember in that first discussion so many years later and some years ago now, I could still hear that emotion in his voice as he recalled the story to me, through a bad cell connection in the mountains of Colorado. And that stood out in my mind. And just fascinating, that. And it's so unusual to have two pilots, to go on the record. I mean, granted, you're retired now and this sort of thing, but as Don Ledger would tell us if he were here today as a guest, I was talking to Don the other day. He has made kind of a second career in the field collecting these stories, being a technical affiliate for what is it, NARCAP, Michael? The group that devotes
NICAP.
itself exclusively, not NICAP, the one that does just pilot sightings at Richard Hall.
Oh, I didn't know
Not
about
Rich,
that.
yeah,
Knife on, knife,
yeah. I can't,
Mar,
I can't think of the.
Marfon or Mufon.
No, it's not MUFON. That's the Mutual UFO Network. We had one of their people on last week. Whatever the group is, we're lost for the acronym at the moment. But he could tell you how rare it is to get pilots to come forward to sign a document, as you and Michael both have, as to your renditions of that evening so long ago, and to stand by that story. And it's a very important thing. It goes a long way. Pilot sightings are amongst the best. You and everybody else that constituted crew in that cockpit would certainly be interpreted by me and most others as professional witnesses. Your
Absolutely.
details, your memories are very important. And like I say, for Michael to perhaps have the best view at the time, by being able to be out of his seat. You guys at the time were about halfway across there, I think, in the Gulf of Maine. You were coming up, I think he said near the Davies intersection where you were to be handed off to Moncton Center.
It was approaching the dividing line between Boston Center and Moncton Center, and so that
Yeah.
the intersection. The intersection over the years has had different names, Whale, Davy, and then they're all fish names now. and
Mhm.
that was the approximate position where we were getting turned over to Moncton Control. So that would be maybe 30 miles south of the coast of Nova Scotia, where we were looking down angularly, maybe over the nose of the airplane. We could see clearly. We could see the south
Yeah.
coast of Nova Scotia.
You know what I
But
find interesting about this is that just thinking about lighting. So on your aircraft, the 707, you would have had the anti-collision light on the top of the tail and the nav lights. That'd be about it. And whatever's illumination, the cockpit would have been dark. So thinking of it from the point of view of the object, you would have been pretty darn hard to spot.
well, as I recall, the 707, like the 74, had a rotating beacon on the top and
Mhm.
on the bottom as well. So he
Oh,
would
on the
be
bottom.
getting
Okay, so you would have had two there.
intermittent
Yeah.
flashes, and
Mhm.
then it would not have. I don't remember this, but it would not have surprised me if we hadn't turned on our landing lights at the wing route. Um, there are a couple of really high powered uh, headlights, and when we see traffic approaching us throughout the whole world, everybody does this. When you see traffic
Mhm.
approaching, you often, as a courtesy, turn your lights on, and then when the other guy turns his light on, well, then you know you've
Mhm.
seen each other, and then you turn the lights off. Now, I don't remember whether we had the lights on, but I would suspect we did, and I
I
would
would
suspect,
imagine you probably did. Yeah.
yeah, I can't imagine that they didn't see us.
Mm.
Yeah.
I feel sure, but
Yeah. Once you put those
I
landing lights on, thered be no question. Yeah.
well,
It sounds to
if
me like they
if
were
I
tracking you.
not sure. To this day, I see Michael frequently, a couple times a year, and in fact, I'm waiting for him to come up and stay with us as we speak. But if I can, if we have the time, I'd just like to point out that the custom of the day was that when airline pilots saw these things, they were encouraged to keep them to themselves. Uh,
Mhm.
an incident that very briefly, a United Airline pilot that just passed away here in the community told me a couple of years back. He said that when he was a young co-pilot flying a Viscount southbound over about North Carolina or South Carolina, the captain said to him, he said, "You're new here, right, on this run?" This guy Dick said, "Yeah, I'm just been just out of school." He said, "Well," he said, "on this particular route at this particular spot," he said, "we often see lights, but we don't know if they track along with us." And a minute or two later, the captain said, "There he is. There's one." And Dick had to raise himself up in his seat to look down, but he saw the light, and
Hmm.
and he said, "What
Wow.
is it?" And the captain said, "I don't know, but we see them." And then he said, "Now the light's moving over to your side." And sure enough, Dick looked over down 45 degrees, and the light came over on the right side of the Viscount. And a
Hmm.
short time later, it disappeared. So Dick said to his
Wow.
captain, "Oh, I'm going to make a report to the chief pilot." Captain said, "Tell you what, son, you keep your mouth shut. The chief pilot's office doesn't want to hear anything about this. We don't want any newspaper articles or just." And he said, from that day to this, he said, "I never told anybody except maybe a couple buddies over a beer." So we were
Mhm.
we were not encouraged to disclose those incidents, and there's probably a lot of neat stuff out there that nobody's ever heard.
Yeah. When the
Yeah.
question came from Logan as to whether you wanted to file a report, was there any dissension in the cockpit? I take it was Kurt that would have made the decision not to.
Kurt, it was his decision, and any report emanating from that airplane would have had his signature, so it was proper to ask him. And he said, you know, some of those things you wish
Don't need it.
you wish you hadn't opened the box, So he said
Hmm.
no.
Yeah, I mean, I picture a scene. I think that was that kind of scenario. Anybody that's tried to picture what it was like, the dynamic of that, the command structure, that decision. That's one of the few things that I think is well covered in the old classic movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That sequence in the where they have that near collision near the Indianapolis airport there, right? That's actually based on a true case and follows it very accurately. And I love how they ask twice whether they want to file a UFO report, and you hear the tone change in the
Yeah.
crew's voice, and they're like, "Yeah, I don't think we want to do that."
Nah.
And a very young
What
Morgan
would be the
Freeman says,
point?
"Yeah, I wouldn't know what kind of report to file either," and
I
away it
would know.
goes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you one of the things you say. It's a living case, and that's true in Shag Harbor. I don't get things in my mailbox every day, but Ralph, but I can update you on one thing. Um, you and Kurt, of course, and most people that night on the ground even simply just observed lights over Shag Harbor. And typical saw some of them saw them in a flash and pattern. Some saw them steady. For many, it like you say, it looked like landing lights coming at you, the big lights. But one of the things we know since it took me many years, but I finally tracked down the lightkeeper's wife. And at the time, she had left, remarried, left the province. We know that we knew by, tales within the community that she was perhaps the first person to report it. Wickens was the first one to call RCMP, but there was some hope that she would be one of the people that didn't lose sight of it behind the tree line as so many did who were driving. And when we discovered this woman, her name is now Mrs. Isabel Towers. And yes, she was the lightkeeper's wife. She was awake that night on the island in their home because they were manned lighthouses in those days, looking toward the shore knitting. And she sees these set of lights coming into the water, and she jumps up and goes to the living room window, Ralph, and says, "Oh my God, a plane's going to crash." So she stands there and watches what happens. Now, here's the stroke of luck here. As the UFO hits the water, coming toward her in her island home, looking toward the shoreline of Shag Harbor, the water wells up over the UFO. And that caused the lights to reflect back and illuminate the object. And she could see that it was a classic saucer shaped thing. As she put it first, before I drew further detail out of her, she says, "No, it had no, Chris," she goes, "it had no nose or anything." And she went and woke her husband up, and she simply said, I don't know what's happened. She goes, "I think a plane's crashed." He called her crazy and didn't want to get her to bed, let alone saying the UFO. And it was quite an argument between them. But she had a very good view, and it was her that contacted the Coast Guard and made that first report. But she's one of the very few. We believe, Don and I have always believed there are others down there, but it was very hard to track down. It was only a couple years ago that we found her, verified she was the wife. She wrote us a letter, showed things at the time, but she saw it enter the water and she could discern the physical shape behind the lights. One of the very few. I'm sure there's others. We'll probably never get that lucky again. Many of them take it with them to the grave, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
so
I have a question for Ralph. Ralph, we've been talking about the physical aspects of what went on. I'm just curious what was going on in your mind once you put the pilot out of the picture and just you, Ralph, looking at this thing. Did you have any thoughts about, I don't know, that the feeling of being watched or anything unusual?
I I have an opinion about that because Mike and I see each other and we talk about this even after 50 odd years. And I think the thing that was going through my mind was um, the mind cannot perceive things, or the eyes cannot perceive things, and the mind cannot process data about events that there is no reality to. In other words, I was not familiar with ever seeing strange lights in the sky I have seen everything you can imagine: stars, shooting stars, the moon rising on a crescent, a spear coming out of the ocean. I've seen,
Hmm.
I've seen reflections. But that was something that my mind couldn't comprehend. What was it that I had just seen that hung in the air like that and accelerated to such a phenomenal speed? So probably the most consistent emotion that I had was, what was that? My
Hmm.
mind, my all my experiences couldn't process it because there was never anything like that that I had ever seen.
Right. You had nothing to compare it to. How long did it take from the moment that it started to accelerate that it disappeared? In seconds? 2 seconds? 3 seconds?
Yes, I would say 4 or 5 seconds. It was moving. It was moving eastward towards London, towards Europe, at a very good clip, but it was accelerating and over the azimuth, say
Hmm.
probably 90 degrees. Boy, the last 45 degrees, it just accelerated beyond belief, and the lights, of course, they merged to a single dot and were gone.
Hmm. So we're
It was
talking
quick.
at least tens of thousands of miles per hour.
Oh, would have to be. It would have nobody in the cockpit. We all said we never saw anything move that fast in our lives. That was
Wow.
universally accepted.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the space shuttle, it does 20,000 miles an hour. You can sit there and watch it cross the sky. It takes a good minute, you
Yep.
know?
Yep. And that's going
So
Yeah.
it,
fast.
and that's going fast, 25,000 miles an hour. Yeah, that's incredible. That is really incredible. And I think to me, that would be the real kicker watching that thing accelerate away.
Tell me something, Ralph. The guys in the back that were deadheading with you there, that Michael Littlepage went back and woke up. You guys continued on, obviously, across the pond that night, as they say, across the Atlantic Ocean. Did any of them go back to bed, or did you guys stay up chatting about this? What was it like in the cockpit?
Mike will be the first to tell you that he did not feel like going to sleep that night. He tells me that he frequently looked out the window both sides to see if anything was nearby. Uh, he was concerned. He was again, having had the best look at this event. He was
Mm.
concerned. He was frightened. Um, to one extent or another, he was highly concerned, is probably the best description. And so the other guys, as I recall, there was plenty of conversation. We were drinking coffee and talking about what we had seen, because uh, to every one of us, it was a remarkable sighting, a remarkable event. And then, like I say, it went in my life. It went dormant for 25 years, and until until I guess I got made somehow. I forgot how we made contact, Chris. Um,
Well,
oh,
I'll
oh,
tell
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah.
I'll,
That's right.
I'll
You
I'll
got
tell you. Yeah, I got cheat notes here. I wrote a book about it at the time, right? And
Yeah,
we
that's what
managed
it
to get
was.
in that one. And what it is when you were in Pennsylvania, the show was called Fear.net, that was doing the
Yes,
ghost sighting
that's
thing.
right.
Fear.net. And the reason it got back to us is, and the guy asked you about your sighting and whatever, is one of the guys helping out with that because he had multiple interests. His name was Butch Watkowski, and he was the Pennsylvanian state director for MUFON. And of course, he made the connection to Shag Harbor because he was familiar with the case. It had started to become known in the U.S. due to what Don and I and others had done. And he was unable to get hold of me. I kind of keep a low profile, but he got hold of Stanton Friedman, who's of course was very well known. Stanton sent everything on to Don and I, and it went from there. The amazing thing about this, again, to take us back, to give a little more meaning, when I always like to brag how, look, Shag Harbor is the gift that keeps on giving, the case, right? Here you go. I had just explained away Air Canada 305. And by the way, that explanation was that we believe, and as the flight crew now believes, that sighting was the result of a launch from Wallops Island in Virginia, and they were launching a cosmic ray experiment. And this was a suborbital flight that went about 75 miles up and vented noble gases into the atmosphere that made an incredible sighting display. One of the things I remember that was so cool is when we put the sighting to bed is that the co-pilot, Bob Ralph, told me that when they initially saw it, they didn't know what it was, but the direction they were looking at, they were flying over Saint Jean, Quebec at the time. And in the direction they were looking, they were afraid what might have happened to New York, and they radioed Mirabel in Montreal and said, do you know if New York is still there? They thought it might have been nuclear war. But the case is now an IFO, so us ufologists who are, so often labeled hopeless believers in that, we do sometimes solve them and put them to bed. But here's the cool thing, Ralph, about you, and when you stepped in, the timing was so great. When that case was solved, it was August the 15th, 2008, right? And that was the result of them seeing a documentary I'd done in the time, a US-based one called Canada's Roswell. Okay, it's part of a series called UFO Files. They saw that our feature, once again, those pilots, Bob Ralph and Guy Charbonneau from the old Viscount flight, got hold of Stanton Friedman and us. I went online, used a bunch of tools, came up with the Wallops Island explanation of that rocket. They agreed with it, went to bed, all was happy. 6 weeks later, Stanton calls me about you. 6 weeks later. And once again, we have a great view, but this time it's on point. You're in the right place. And this one did matter. And I felt great about it right from the start and have always since. It's an intricate part of the story. It's integral, I should say. And you're part of history now. And I know this has been interesting. I know you've done other shows. You've done some television. I think you've been on some of these internet feeds like BuzzFeed and things like that. Tell me something. Do you think, did you ever see anything else in your career or anything since that you felt was unexplainable that you would label a UFO, you or anybody else on the crew?
Here's a quick, strange story. About a year ago, my daughter says to me, she lives here nearby. She said, there's a guy who owns a pizza shop over in South Daytona. He would like you to come over and look at some movies of a UFO that he took in his backyard. And he said, if you come over, he'll buy you a pizza. So, I mean,
deal.
Sounds like
who can refuse that offer?
Yeah, deal.
Right. Yeah. The airline pilot's credo: if it's free, it's for me. So over we go. And
also, the flight instructor credo, just so you know.
Okay. And he whips out his camera after he took our order, and my daughter and I had a wonderful pizza there. And he takes out his camera, and he said he took this from his backyard. He said, I don't know what this is. He said, can you tell me what it is? Because he had heard, I don't know, he was familiar with me and my involvement with Shag Harbor somehow. And so he let me watch while he's making the pizza. And there's about 10 minutes of dancing lights, kind of bright lights that are moving around in circles, accelerating, going up, going down. And you can tell it's in his backyard because you can see the tops of houses near at the bottom of the screen, trees, telephone poles. And when the film ended, I said, I don't know what these are. And I thought about having him send them on to more professional investigators like you guys. And it was just a remarkable sequence of lights. And it looked like it was in the afternoon, a blue sky. And here are these lights, and they danced. And I don't know what they were, and he doesn't know what they were.
I always laugh. I always laugh at the people, the so-called open-minded scientists, physicists, and whatnot, to say if there was a UFO phenomenon, we'd have good video of it. We'd have good photographs. It's like, well, have you ever actually just looked? It's everywhere.
Well,
it's everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Pilot sightings. tens of
In,
thousands of pilot sightings over the years.
in fact,
I think
somebody called. Go ahead, Ralph. Go ahead.
I think that what people should understand, the public in general should understand, is there are sightings and there are highly qualified sightings. If you take
Yeah.
a sighting, an incident that was witnessed by, I don't know, a lighthouse keeper, a ship's captain or crew member,
Mhm.
an airline pilot, people who are in the habit of looking out at the sky. If
Mhm.
they tell you what they saw, they probably are accurately describing it, and that those incidents should be viewed with a lot more veracity than a housewife who fell down and happened to look up and saw stars.
Oh,
Mhm.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Ralph, you need to keep looking up because I don't know how aware you are of this or not. I know once or twice over the years since we last met. And by the way, that was 2017 at the 50th anniversary of the Shag Harbor incident. That's
Right,
when you were
right,
up.
right.
Hopefully, it'll happen this year with our UFO Expo in Yarmouth. Anybody interested, you can find that online at ufoexpo.com. I'll stop with the shameless plug there now. But here's the thing. There's hope that we may find it yet. As you may remember, I saw something in Dartmouth. I wasn't in Shag Harbor. I was a 12-year-old boy when you guys were flying over. And the next night on the 4th, I saw something here in Dartmouth, sort of thing, that's part of that overall story. However, in 2018, me, Lori, another resident in Shag Harbor, and Justin Brown, who's often a co host on the show with me, we were on Cape Sable Island September 15th. Daytime, bright sun, no clouds. We had an orb sighting that lasted an hour and 20 minutes, and it would appear and disappear. And I'm going to tell you, there ain't no conventional explanation that'll suffice. So, although it was all those years in between, I get a second chance, and you might yet. You got to keep looking up. I tell people, take your hands out of your pockets, look up. You got to look, like Michael points out there. I think if people look, they might be shocked at what they may see. You know?
Absolutely.
God, it's
Listen,
been a
Ralph, it
pleasure.
was super to have you on the show. We got our extra music coming in there. Please stick around after we close the show. Ralph will say a goodbye and we'll say a personal
Yeah.
goodbye to you. Um,
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
thank you
so
very
that's a
much.
really fascinating. Yeah, thank you. And it's great you're looking happy and healthy and you're sunning it down in Florida. Good for you. You're in the land of aviation. So I don't know if you still go visit the airfields or not, or keep your finger
Well,
in
I
it.
live in the world's largest fly-in community. We have some 600 airplanes based here in the community, and
Nice, nice.
I still, although I sold my last airplane, I still keep up my interest in aviation.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's
Hopefully you.
yeah. What as they say, aviators don't die, and they just fade away, unless of course they stall and spin.
Yeah.
But thank you very
Hopefully we'll
much.
see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully, look, Ralph, you can get up and we'll see you this fall at the UFO Expo. I'd love to meet you and Sharon, your girls again. I have such fond memories of that trip up here and me providing you around when I didn't even have a vehicle. I actually own a car now and a little house, so we could be much more accommodating, right? God, it was good to have you.
Look,
I'm glad I made that call the other day. Take care.
looking forward to our next meeting. Bye bye
Yes.
now.
Thank you. Thank you, folks,
Bye-bye.
for watching FSUFO, another episode with Ralph Lowewinger, Chris Stiles, and myself. Like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. Share it with your enemies. We don't care. Just share it. All the best, everybody, and we'll see you on the next episode of FSUFO.
He said stick around, but were you able to
Yeah.
hear that?
Yeah. If you can hear me, I can hear you, Ralph. Yeah, this will
Yeah,
disappear in a second.
yeah.
We can talk for a minute.
All right.